Welcome everybody to the second session of the AIA Oregon 2025 Fire Resiliency Series. My name is Kurt Wilson. I'm an architect and AIA member living in Eugene, and one of the members of the Fire Resiliency Series Planning Committee, along with my friends Alan, Scott, Jay Raskin, and Logan Craven, who are all joining us today. And we really not only do we want to thank our presenters, but we want to thank Kathy and the AIA Oregon staff for supporting this series. Oh, we're gonna before we I did look down. Did you show our sponsors here? So just a thank you to our sponsors. So thank you very much to them in supporting this program. So this is a 5-session series scheduled every Friday at noon, starting today and ending with a panel discussion on 1024. The sessions that are in front of you are our programs, and I want to encourage you to go to the AI Oregon website web events page to learn more about the speakers and the topics. And if you haven't already, please register to join. This is our second series and our second session, and our first session with Nate Vidasek. You can view that presentation if you didn't get a chance to join us by Googling the AI Oregon YouTube channel. You actually can see a lot of the video presentations from AI Oregon. Pretty great resource. So let's talk about our presentation today, and our as I'm speaking, the continuing education information is going to be on the screen. We are eligible for continuing education credit. And information about learning or the learning information is available on the next slide, and it's also available on the website. Wildfire is both simultaneously a significantly growing threat and more routine for most of us living in Western states. But fires are dynamic, and each one provides the opportunity to increase our knowledge of how to respond and how to build better. Today's session will be led by Evan Schluter. The session will highlight the 2023 Lahaina fire and the 2025 Los Angeles County wildfires, including the commonalities and differences between the two, how fire pathways penetrated the built environment, and what these events reveal about resiliency planning. The goal today is to highlight strategies architects and planners can apply to reduce conflagration risk and strengthen the interface between communities and adjacent wildlands. Evan is a research scientist and engineer at the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety, IBHS. His responsibilities at IBHS include investigating fire behavior and building material performance to wildfire exposure, post-fire analysis, and technically supporting the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home and Neighborhood Program. Evan holds a BS and an MS from fire protection engineering from the University of Maryland, College Park, with over 5 years of experience in fire research and 3 years of experience working as a practicing fire engineering consultant. Evan has a holistic understanding of construction and fire risk. Currently, Evan is focused on developing a method to evaluate material performance to exterior fire exposure and understanding the driving factors of urban conflagration. And I forgot to mention that if you have questions or comments during the session, please put them in the chat, and we'll have time at the end for conversation with Evan. So Evan, welcome to the AI Oregon Fire Resiliency Series.
Thanks so much, Kurt. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, how's that looking on your end? All right.
Looks great.
All right, so hi everyone. I wanted to start off by saying I really appreciate you all attending today and the opportunity to be a part of this series. As Kurt said, my name is Evan Sluter. I'm a research scientist at IBHS, studying the impact of wildfire on the built environment. Prior to my time at IBHS, I've worked as a fire protection engineer in Oregon and New Zealand, and I've studied wildfire flame spread with the U.S. Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Montana. I'm currently based in Portland, Oregon, but I spend a lot of time flying to the East Coast to work out of our research facility in Richburg, South Carolina. Today, we're going to discuss the fires in Lahaina and Los Angeles County and what they tell us about how we design our communities and buildings and where our focus needs to be moving forward. So I want to start off by talking briefly about our work at IBHS. Disasters are the intersection of natural hazards with the built environment. And as we continue to see populations expand, become denser, and natural hazards become more frequent and severe due to the impacts of climate change, the measurable and immeasurable cost of disasters will continue to increase. That's why mitigation is so vital to reducing the damage footprint and preventing unnecessary suffering. And that's what drives us at IBHS. IBHS is an independent nonprofit scientific research and communications organization supported by insurers and reinsurers. From our research center, we study wind, rain, hail, and wildfire, and the way that homes and businesses can become more resilient to these perils. IBHS's building safety research leads to real-world solutions for home and businesses, helping to create more resilient communities. Our unique facility allows us the ability to test at full scale, recreate severe weather, and observe weak links in our structures to understand how failures occur and learn what we can do to prevent them. Many of the most devastating wildfires in the US have share a common theme. Fire spreads from the wildlands into our communities, where losses escalate through structure-to-structure fire spread. The Lahaina fire, the Palisades fire, and the Eaton fire each followed this pattern. They're examples of built environment conflagrations where destruction is driven not only by advancing wildfire front, but by uncontrolled fire spread between structures. Most of our nation's most destructive wildfires have taken place within the last decade. From the Camp Fire, the most destructive in US history, to more recent disasters in Oregon, Tennessee, and Hawaii, these fires remind us that large-scale losses are not confined to the West Coast. They can strike communities across the country from the Pacific Islands to the southeast. When a wildfire enters a community, it can develop into a conflagration. Several factors come together to create these firestorms. To narrow it down, conflagrations follow humans' drought and wind. People account for over 90% of wildfire ignitions, and an increasing population means more people, more structures, and more densely spaced fuels in wildfire-prone areas. Drought at any scale impacts vegetation and human-made combustibles, making them more receptive to ignition. And wind is the single biggest factor that influences extreme fire behavior, leading to conflagration. So people and wind were central to the outcomes of both the Lahaina fire and the LA County fires. We'll see how these elements came together in each case, shaping the intensity and ultimately the devastation in these fires. To give some context to the influence of winds, I wanted to show a demonstration from our laboratory. These two videos show the same burning structure, one under the influence of a 20-mile-an-hour wind and the other with no influence on the wind. Wind in wildfire scenarios leads to increased ember generation, but it also leads to increased oxygen supply to the fire, which increases intensity, and it also alters the flame shape, stretching it and extending it downstream, and also bending it closer to downstream combustibles. So there's a lot of factors that increase when it comes to the intensity of our wildfire exposures when we introduce wind. All right, first we'll discuss the influence of these three factors on the Lahaina fire. So characterized by dry, warm weather and persistent northeasterly trade winds, summer in Hawaii often leads to conditions conducive to fire. The hot, arid climate on the rain-shadowed leeward side of the islands where Lahaina is located lowers the moisture content of fuels, particularly non-native grasses and shrubs, making the area susceptible to rapid fire spread. In 2023, drought conditions further amplified these dry summer conditions. On the day of the fire, a pressure gradient from a nearby hurricane significantly impacted wind speeds, resulting in sustained 50-mile-an-hour downsloping winds. Dense development, vehicles, fences, and other infrastructure in Lahaina created pathways for fire spread and ignition sources. People's influence on the landscape also resorted in abandoned sugarcane agricultural lands being overtaken by those highly flammable non-native grasses I was discussing earlier, which in 2020 covered about 25% of Hawaii's land area. Invasive grasses provided fine, dry fuel receptive to any potential ignition source, and over 85% of the area burned in the Lahaina fire was compromised of these grasslands, including the area around where the fire initially started. And that's what those fine fuels look like. The LA County fires were also strongly impacted by humans' drought and wind. Similar to the Lahaina fire, but on a larger scale, the LA County fires had dense development, vegetation, vehicles, fences, and other infrastructure that created pathways for fire spread and ignition. And when the Palisades and Eaton fires ignited, Southern California was experiencing a flash drought, and LA County was in severe drought conditions. A Santa Ana wind event drove wind gusts over 60 miles an hour and dropped relative humidity under 10%, resulting in conditions conducive to rapid fire spread and ember ignitions or spot fires. To give you some perspective on the intensity of the LA County fires, within the first 24 hours after ignition, the Palisades fire had reached 50% of its final size and 80% of its final size after 48 hours. Similarly, the Eaton fire reached 76% of its final size in 24 hours and 98% of its final size after 48 hours. While these fires continued to burn for more than 40 days, the extreme fire conditions during this initial period led to conflagration and most of the loss caused by these fires. All right, so I mentioned earlier the Lahaina and LA County fires had ignitions that originated in wildland fuels and spread into nearby communities. This is a common pattern that can occur many times throughout the course of a large wildfire, as it moves from developed areas to wildland fuels and back to developed areas. Generally, fires enter through and spread through communities through two primary fire pathways, embers and connected fuels. As communities are initially exposed, structure ignitions via these two fire pathways are a key component of the transition to structure-to-structure fire spread. This video from a homeowner in the Eaton fire provides a visual of structural and vegetative embers. Post-event investigations consistently indicate that most initial structure ignitions and conflagrations result from the accumulation of embers. Embers are a key fire spread mechanism capable of traveling over 2 miles and allow fires to enter our communities and cross fuel breaks like roads, parks, waterways that would otherwise disrupt this fast and uniform fire spread. Both wildland fuels and structure fuels generate embers capable of causing ignitions, but we know that structural fuels produce larger and more numerous embers than vegetative fuels. The more structure ignitions that occur, the more significant the ember exposure is
The
down.
LA fires starting. This is what this is all about. Very interesting.
Thank you. So this next video provided by a homeowner in the Lahaina fire displays how connective fuels can provide pathways for fire to enter communities. In this video, what you're witnessing is that transition from a grassland fire with their wildland fuels to structural fuels. And in this case, this grassland area at the top of the screen spread the fire down to this roadway, and there was a parked vehicle on that roadway. That vehicle ignited and provided a very intense pathway for fire to then expose combustibles and other materials located at the back of the parcels shown there in post-fire imagery. If we take a look at pre-fire imagery, the vegetation and structural fuel loading on those parcels is more apparent. And what this does is it just essentially provides more fuel and then a closer fire exposure to those structures and provides a way for this fire to jump over this roadway. With grass fires, normally we see very small embers, and it's more difficult for these embers to transport and cause ignitions. But when fire can provide direct flame contact to something like a vehicle or a structure, that's where we see some of our highest fire intensity and exposures. And even resilient building materials and other materials in these conditions will ignite. And once that fire was able to pass to the rear of those parcels and ride combustibles up to structures, we saw our first ignitions in this part of the community and a transition of structure to structure fire spread. So using DINS data from the LA County fires, we can visualize examples of these fire pathways and the transition to conflagration. Studies of past conflagrations and the observations by the IBHS team in the Eaton and Palisades fires revealed two distinct patterns in the destruction. We see sporadic losses where smaller clusters of homes are burned, and we see large-scale urban conflagration, driven by structure-to-structure fire spread, resulting in widespread devastation. These patterns were both visible in areas of LA County during our investigation and give valuable insight on these fires. The example we're looking at here is the Palisades fire. Shown on the screen is the approximate ignition location. This is our prevailing wind direction during the fire, and especially during that Santa Ana wind event during that first 48 hours where we saw most of our fire growth. And then we're going to take a look at these two areas within these black boxes. We're going to start up here and then move further down into this second area. So looking at the first area, we see where the built environment first intersects wildland fuels, where we would have seen that initial ignition. And this is where we see the pattern of smaller clusters of homes destroyed. So prior to the involvement of a significant number of structures, the fire and ember exposure intensity that our buildings must withstand is generally less significant than when structural fuels are involved. However, the structural ignitions that do occur generate embers, intense radiant heat, and direct flame contact to neighboring structures, leading to pockets of destruction. So if we take a look at this data, you'll notice that our destroyed structures are shown in red and no damage to structures are shown in black. And then the other colors here show partial damage to certain structures. So you'll notice that on the edge of communities where wildland fuels would have been intersecting structures, you see some partial damage, you see some pockets of total loss. Where we see partial damage of structures, normally we can assume that there's been some firefighter intervention. After structures see an ignition, normally they will progress to a total loss unless there is some either firefighter or homeowner intervention there to prevent that. It's also a clear observation that in these areas where we see lower intensity, firefighter operations are more effective. So we generally see more influence from their work. Moving on to, oh, and again, there's our prevailing wind direction. Moving further into the community, we observe the second pattern, large-scale urban conflagration driven by structure-to-structure fire spread, resulting in widespread devastation. As more and more structures and structural fuels become involved, we see compounding exposures, more intense structural embers, and direct flame contact and radiation from ignited structures, leading to widespread devastation. Once a fire is inside a community, the ignition of structures shifts the fire from wildland fuels to structural and urban fuels, as we just saw. In these cases, wind-driven structure-to-structure fire spread is influenced by three main factors. Our structure density, how closely spaced our buildings are. Our connective fuels, the different combustible items between our structures, whether they be human-made sheds or things of that nature or vegetation. And then finally, our building materials. How resilient are our building materials and what types of exposures can they withstand without igniting? Our investigation of the Lahaina fire helped identify these three key factors of conflagration, and our most recent survey of the Eaton and Palisades fires reconfirmed a lot of what we observed initially. On both fires, our teams looked at the influence of fuel factors, building components, and structure separation, utilizing data collected in the field, pre- and post-fire imagery, and DINS data on the Palisades and Eaton fires. All right, so now we'll go through each of these factors individually, highlighting analysis and imagery that illustrates how they impact ignition and loss. And we're going to start with structure density. All right, so again, this is a analysis that was completed on the Palisades fire, and this is included in, this is some of our preliminary detailed analysis of the LA County fires. So clusters of homes were grouped by neighborhood, as shown in the image above. And for each cluster, a mean minimum structure separation distance was calculated utilizing structure footprint data available online. And incorporating DINS data, we're able to plot mean minimum structure separation distance in each of these neighborhoods or communities against the percentage of structures that was destroyed in each community. And what we're able to observe is there's a very strong relationship between structure separation distance and the percent of structures that were lost in each of these communities. And what we see here is that when we look at structure separation distances on the order of 10 feet and less, we see very high percentages of structures destroyed within these communities. As we start to increase structure separation distance to 20 feet and above, we see a very steep decline in the number of structures that are destroyed. This relationship between structure separation and exposure and damage is something that we've been studying at our laboratory facility in South Carolina, and it's been our latest full-scale research project. This project has helped us better understand the influence of structure separation, orientation, and wind speed on the likelihood of ignition or loss in wildfire scenarios. In the analysis of these experiments, one of our goals was to understand how damage intensity varies rather than just a complete loss or no damage. So adding more granularity to the types of results that we see from these exposures. And in order to do that, we separated out damage categories from these tests into 5 different categories. So total loss, where we see ignition of our target structure in a manner that means that we have to intervene in order to prevent that structure from being completely consumed. And then we have potential total loss, where we see key components of our exterior envelope fail, like glazing or vents or things of that nature, where large openings are created in the exterior envelope that make the structure vulnerable to ember intrusion or flame intrusion. And then severe damage and minor damage include primarily aesthetic failures, charring of the exterior siding, bowing, or cracking of the siding, things of that nature that would require repairs, but don't immediately put the structure at risk of loss. And then, of course, no damage. The results that you're seeing on the screen right now are from the initial phase of our structure separation experiments, where we tested fuel loads within shed structures at different wind speeds and separation distances from our target ADU. And 2 key things I want to point out here. At 10-foot separation distances, our results agree with the observations that we have from the Palisades fire that I just shown. The intensity of the exposure that we see at short separation distances is so significant that even our most resilient building materials aren't able to withstand those exposures. But as we increase the separation distance to 20 feet, we start to see more variety in our results. The exposure is reduced enough that the use of resilient building materials or structure orientation begin to have an impact on the outcome of the exposure. You'll also notice a few structures on this plot that have a wind icon next to them. Those are experiments that were run with 50-mile-an-hour winds. With this increased wind speed, what we observe is the necessary structure separation distance to reduce the exposure increases. So that wind variable has the capability again to drastically increase the exposure that we see in these fires. This damage pattern held when we were in Lahaina. A lot of the neighborhoods and communities that we saw with average structure separation distances of 10 or 20 feet resulted in total loss. A statistical analysis of the data from the Lahaina fire investigation illustrates that key features that influence the damage of structures in our IBHS data set. These top 10 influential variables are assessed as color-coded and separated into factors. And what we were able to observe from this is the structure density factors were observed to be the most influential, while the impact of building materials was observed to be the least influential. This again aligns with the results from our experiments. Extreme exposures generated by structural fuels and high structure density overwhelms even our most resilient building materials. When our intensity of exposures are so high, we lose the ability to make an impact on our structures through increased resiliency in our building materials. All right, next we'll discuss connective fuels. As we have already said, connective fuels provide a pathway for fire to move into and through our communities. When we think about fuels in wildfire, we often picture trees, grass, and shrubs in the wildland. But in conflagration conditions, it's important to recognize that all combustible materials, both vegetative and human-made, are part of the risk. This includes things that we don't normally think of as fuels, such as privacy hedges shown here, ornamental plants, wood fences, landscaping mulch. These are all connective fuels capable of carrying flames directly from one structure to another. The video shown was provided by CAL FIRE and gives an example of how privacy hedges, which were very common in both the LA County fire and the Lahaina fire, give fire a pathway between structures and are a receptive fuel for ember ignitions, which required attention from firefighting resources in that second video shown there. Human-made fuels are also a risk. Commonly observed connective fuels included trash cans, sheds, fences, patio furniture, decks, hot tubs, and even vehicles, which were a primary connective fuel in Lahaina. The key point here is that under extreme conditions, any combustible items can connect fire from house to house. Connective fuels are especially dangerous when they are located within Zone 0, the first 5 feet immediately surrounding a structure. Zone 0 is the final opportunity to create a fuel break between combustibles and the exterior envelope of the structure to reduce the potential for ignition. When the fuels we have been discussing, like trash cans, vegetation, synthetic lawns, mulch, or trees, ignite within those first 5 feet, this results in direct flame contact, resulting in those most intense, very high heat exposures. To reduce this risk, we emphasize 2 complementary strategies. Maintaining a non-combustible Zone 0, so absolutely no combustibles within those first 5 feet, and creating a defensible space in Zone 1, keeping the 5 feet to the end of the parcel lean, clean, and green, so spacing vegetation and tree canopies, removing ladder fuels, and reducing potential fire intensity that might otherwise threaten the structure. A couple notes on these slides here. A lot of the information that we gain from partially damaged structures in post-disaster investigations are thanks to firefighter intervention, particularly the 3 images shown on the right-hand side of the slide. These structures all experienced ignitions that were progressing to total loss. But due to the fact that firefighters were on scene and able to extinguish the exposures, we're able to see how these were cascading towards failure. On the Palisades fire, it is actually trash day when the fire ignited. And you'll notice in this image in the garage on the bottom, We were able to identify this as a trash can exposure because the catch bar was the only thing that's left there from the trash can. But this is a very common failure that we observed where um, trash cans were vulnerable to ember ignition, not because of the plastic itself was igniting, but it was melting and allowing embers to enter the trash bins. And then the trash itself was actually the combustible that was producing very substantial exposures to structures. And also, embers were capable of igniting trees as well that were within our zone 0. This is an example from the Lahaina fire, again provided by a homeowner there. And one thing I want to point out in this video is how close some building materials can get pushed to the point of ignition, and the presence of small combustibles, which may seem like small vegetation not capable of producing high heat loads, can cause ignition. What's happening to the structure in this video that we're looking at here, the gases that are coming off of the siding and the fascia board there, those are combustible gases. Um, when fuels are preheated to the point that we see often in high intensity fire exposures like this, they reach a point where they begin to break down in off-gas combustible gases. And those gases mix with oxygen in the air, and essentially they're primed for ignition. So even something like a small ember or a very low intensity fire has the potential to ignite the side of that structure in this instance. In our post-disaster investigation of the Lahaina fire, we focused on the role of fuel coverage within Zone 0 and how it influenced loss. We observed a clear pattern. When vegetation coverage in Zone 0 exceeded 60%, the likelihood of destruction was 3 times higher. This underscores the critical importance of keeping Zone 0 free of combustible materials. Even in large-scale conflagrations, conditions in this small area can be the difference. And finally, we'll discuss the impact of building materials. Building materials can play a significant role in how a structure performs during a wildfire. Features like non-combustible siding, double-pane windows, and Class A roof coverings improve resilience. However, as we've discussed, even the best materials are rarely able to withstand the extreme exposures created by direct flame contact and high levels of radiant heat when surrounding fuels are not mitigated. In the Palisades and Eaton fires, many homes were constructed with resilient materials, yet they were still lost. The ignition of connective fuels within Zone 0, like hot tubs or privacy hedges, or combustible building features like pergolas, decks, and retaining walls, created direct exposures that these materials simply could not withstand. Right, so a few examples in this slide here that I want to discuss. A few examples of successes as well. So in the top left corner here, we had a hot tub and retaining wall ignition. This corner of the house actually had a pretty good zone 0. Both a retaining wall and that hot tub were outside the first 0 to 5 feet. And despite this, a very intense exposure was provided to the structure, but non-combustible exterior siding, double pane tempered windows, and enclosed eaves helped this structure resist that exposure. However, in a situation over here, the ignition of a deck resulted in direct flame contact to some double pane tempered glazing of that exterior portion of the structure there. And even that resilient glazing and non-combustible exterior siding failed in that exposure and resulted in a large opening in that exterior envelope. Another example of a hot tub here. This instance, the wind would have been pushing out of the photo here, so not exactly sure how that would have worked with that recirculation around that corner. It would have been a very complex flow, but could have reduced the exposure. But again, failures in the exterior openings, this structure was pushed to the absolute brink. Pergola exposure here, and again, privacy hedge. Outside of zone 0, thankfully, but again, pushed this double pane window, thankfully, to the limit. In Lahaina, we observed the impact of Class A roof cover. Our analysis showed that homes without Class A roofs were destroyed over 80% of the time. Combustible roof coverings are particularly vulnerable to embers, which we know are the leading cause of ignition in large wildfire events. We've also been able to observe the positive impacts of mitigation. Many homes that incorporated risk reduction measures, intentionally or not, showed improved chances of survival. However, a recurring pattern emerged. While some structures had addressed large portions of their potential exposures, they still had critical vulnerabilities that ultimately led to ignition. So this structure incorporated a non-combustible zone 0 for a couple sides of their structure, but had an ignition of combustible materials stored against the side of the house at the rear of the property, um, which resulted in a very high fire exposure to this door here and ignition of the fascia board here. Some water spray patterns on the rear of this structure and the fact that this ignition was extinguished indicate that firefighter intervention was again responsible for this structure not being a total loss. Another common example that kind of happens with these types of failures is weak link building materials like single pane windows or combustible exterior door frames igniting, where other building materials like non-combustible siding and things of that nature don't ignite. So this is an example of a high intensity exposure that this structure experienced. Two consumed structures were on either side of it at separation distances of 15 and 20 feet. But mitigation can give homes a fighting chance. This structure featured a non-combustible, mostly complete non-combustible zone 0 on either side of the structure. And they also benefited from CMU block wall shielding. So shielding in this instance talks about how large non-combustible features like this wall in this instance can mitigate a lot of the heat exposure to our structure. But again, this is a successful instance of lack of connective fuels and reduced fire exposure, preventing ignition. But that being said, these exposures are intense, and it only takes one building component failing to have the potential for ignition. So in summary, we have observed that protecting a structure and reducing the likelihood of ignition means that our structure and the immediate surroundings need to work together. To protect our structures, reduce potential fire exposures, and increase resilience, we need to simultaneously reduce exposure by removing or relocating fuels and increase our structure's resilience through hardening the exterior materials to resist what exposures remain. Focusing on exposure reduction or increasing resilience individually is not a practical or achievable solution in many situations. We know that since embers are capable of traveling so far and are so prolific that we always anticipate structures to receive an ember exposure in a wildfire event. So we always need to be weary of those. But we also want to make sure that our houses are livable and appealing. So we do want some form of vegetation or other combustibles on our parcels. And increasing resilience alone is also not an achievable or practical solution in many instances. Constructing our materials out of concrete block or as a bunker capable of withstanding any type of wildfire exposure is not aesthetic or cost effective in many instances. The combination of our laboratory research and post-disaster investigation has been distilled into the Wildfire Prepared Home program. This program establishes a benchmark of exposure reduction and home hardening strategies that meaningfully reduce a structure's wildfire risk. It includes two levels: a wildfire prepared home program, which focuses on addressing the most prolific cause of loss in wildfire embers, and Wildfire Prepared Home Plus, which expands protection to include mitigation against direct flame contact and radiant heat exposures. Together, they provide a path for improving wildfire resilience at the parcel level. We also have our recently released Wildfire Prepared Neighborhood Program, which provides a process to evaluate wildfire risk at the neighborhood scale. It assesses multiple factors, including the threat from external fuels, structure separation, and the presence of connected fuels within a community, the effectiveness of fuel breaks and fire breaks around the neighborhood, and it identifies mitigation actions needed to reduce the risk of community-scale fire spread and conflagration. This expands our focus from the parcel level to the neighborhood level, recognizing that we need to start acknowledging wildfire resilience as a shared responsibility across our communities. So just take a final second here to acknowledge that what we just discussed and what it tells us about our collective effort to reduce risk in these scenarios. We need to focus on preventing ignitions. Every ignition prevented, especially at the early stages of fire development, creates significant differences in downstream impacts. Reducing ignitions of structures is key in mitigating the conflagrations we have seen in recent years. Our wildfire prepared and wildfire prepared neighborhood standards are publicly available on our website at ibhs.org or at wildfireprepared.org. And also, if you're interested in more of a deep dive into our post-disaster analysis of the Lahaina fire, that's available publicly on our website as well as two preliminary reports on the LA County fires. We will be releasing a full research report that does a more deep dive onto the data analysis from the LA County wildfires, and that will be released soon. So thanks so much for your time and attention today. Appreciate it.
Evan, that's really great and some really wonderful, really great information. And before we stop sharing screen, you had a slide. It was near the end of the structural density section, and it was showing a graph of what was implying kind of levels of risk. And it was more of a bar graph, and it had roofing at the bottom in terms of the way it was formatted. And this one right here.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about this? And it's interesting that roof material is listed. As I'm understanding this, this is a lower level of importance, meaning but we often hear roof materials in Class A roofs as an important criteria. So help me understand what is the message of the information in this slide.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is definitely not to say that roof material is not important. And kind of going back to that other slide where when we did have combustible roofs, we saw loss almost every single time.
Right.
This analysis is mainly just to show what factors were most important across our whole data set. So there's two things going on there. One is how dependent loss was on structure separation distance. And again, the point is structure separation distance was so key in the result of whether or not we saw loss across all of our data set that it turns out as the most important factor, dwarfing all of the other factors. The other important part of that is most of the roof materials that we observed across our data set were asphalt, shingle, tile, other things of that nature. And for those roofs, roof material wasn't a key factor. So the percentage of our data set that was
Okay.
combustible roofs was a smaller percentage. And the impact of structure separation distance was
Okay. So a lot of those materials were Class A, presumably, so their impact wasn't much of a distinction. Based on the testing you're familiar with, is there, I mean, there's a lot of different assemblies that can be incorporated to meet a Class A roof, whether it's
Yeah.
metal or asphalt or whatnot. Is there deviations or within Class A rating systems themselves in terms of which might be ones to avoid?
That's a great question, and actually something I've been working on a lot recently. So, um, I have kind of a few answers to that, but the Class A ASTM E108 standard, which
Right.
designates our roofing materials, is a pass-fail test, right? A lot of our test methods that test our building materials are. And we've observed that it doesn't do a very good job of distinguishing between our Class A building materials. There's not an asphalt shingle on the market right now that doesn't achieve a Class A rating, since we've moved to including the fiberglass mat. Um, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I'm not sure that's important. But at the moment, there isn't a good way to distinguish between
Okay.
Class A roof coverings. One, because of the limitations of the test method, and two, um, the exposures that these roof systems experience in wildfires aren't necessarily mimicked exactly by
Test.
ASTM E108. We're
Right.
just placing a block of burning wood on our roof system for the burning brand test, but that's not going to mimic how small vegetative or structural embers might lodge
Right.
themselves in that roof system vulnerability. So,
Right. Right. Well, I've got a bunch of questions, but I don't want to. I want other people to turn on their cameras. We got a handful of questions in the chat. Jay or Alan, maybe you could turn on your camera and ask those questions directly.
I
And
I have
anybody
a
else?
question.
Great,
I have a
Logan.
question, Evan, and it was a very early slide,
okay.
maybe the fifth slide or so. It was under I think its title is like pathways, um,
Yeah.
and it was a picture of the some homes, yeah, right before, way before that, and it was showing you an aerial, and there's three homes that are intact in this one, this one.
Yeah.
These three homes in the foreground, they all seem similar in design, and they're surrounded by, nothing. What
Right.
do you have any idea what gave those the edge?
It's really hard to say when we look at it at this scale. And that's, I think, people really get hung up on, oh, this one home survived, right? Or this one group of homes survived. Like, what aspect of these building materials or this specific setup resulted in um, these structures surviving? The how like wildfire is such a difficult disaster to study because the exposure changes on a scale that is like by individual feet.
Huh.
Um, just because of how, like, this is purely an example, but um, like the influence of large infrastructure like this water tank or how these structures burned, or something could change wind flow patterns of these burned structures that influenced how much exposure these structures saw. Um, in this instance, you can see ignition of some vegetation at the back of this parcel. Um, there could have been firefighters set up here as well. Um, NIST has done some good reports and good reporting on specifically the Waldo Canyon fire that describes how difficult it is to come into a post-disaster scenario without talking to every single firefighter that was out there, and analyzing as much video data as you can possible to really recreate or absolutely understand the types of exposures that the structures experienced. Because it is such a complex phenomenon, you either need to see it or talk to someone that was there to definitely know what has happened. And that's why we spend so much time and effort getting as close as we can to these scenarios in our full-scale testing. Because unless, you're instrumenting and trying to understand what's happening in the moment, it's really hard to say definitely what's going on in
Got it.
these scenarios. So, but
Similar,
I can
similar to
say,
tornadoes.
yeah, yeah,
You have no idea.
exactly. Great question, though. Thank you.
Ellen, you want to ask? Are you still with us? If you can, if
Yeah,
you
I'm
want
here.
to. Okay, I'm not seeing you here, so why don't you
Okay.
go ahead? You can ask us questions. I'll love to hear them.
Sure. Kevin, great presentation, by the way. So thank you. Really informative. It seemed clear from the evidence you were sharing that that the density of structures can sort of overwhelm even buildings that are made with resilient, exterior materials and such. Um, and that seemed pretty clear. But of course, for decades, we've been talking about, higher density communities are important for keeping housing affordable and making walkable communities and things like that. And so it seems like those are like butting heads with each other. Do you have some thoughts about how we can hold on to some of our beloved sustainable urban planning principles
Yeah,
without subjecting those communities to destruction by fire?
absolutely. So I think our strategy really needs to change. And, um, another important consideration here is that, 95% of the homes in the LA County fires were built before Chapter 7A was even implemented, right? So none of these homes were initially designed with wildfire really at the forefront of our thinking. Also for housing density, things like residential multifamily, things like that, commercial type structure, larger structures, we're able to defend and put in the same mitigation practices we would on a single family home. Um, Also, if we prevent like all the structure spacing information I'm providing, we're always assuming one structure has been ignited, and then we have a 10-foot structure separation distance is a problem. But a key consideration there is that we have an ignition, right, in a wildfire scenario. If we're able to address ember exposures, if we're able to address those connective fuel pathways that allow wildfire to enter our communities, we can have higher structure densities. We just need to make sure that we are always constantly aware and addressing the potential for ignitions and fire spread between our structures. So even in a retrofit aspect, if we're addressing our ember exposures and those wildfire pathways, we make a huge difference on those initial ignitions. And if we have less initial structure ignitions, our firefighting resources are more effective. Those cascading effects happen slower, and we see significantly lower impacts in our communities. I mean, even if you go to that slide where I have the DINS data in that first section, you'll notice um, we see cascading effects where we have one ignition. So if our prevailing wind direction is this way, you could hypothesize that maybe we had fire in this vegetative area here. These three structures ignited. Embers were pushed downstream across this street. All these structures were ignited, and it continued to progress. But if we had addressed ember exposure, not even our connective fuel pathways, but just ember exposure for all of our homes in these areas, these three homes may have ignited due to connected fuel direct flame contact. But this roadway here, we're going to get a 60 or 70-foot structure separation distance there. If you remember from our experimental research or the analysis of the structure separation in the Palisades neighborhoods, when we have structure separation distances on the order of 40 feet, 30 feet and above, we're not seeing that structure flame spread. What we're seeing is ember ignitions, moving that fire along over these
Mhm.
roadways and through our communities. But even
Mhm.
just addressing the embers, um, this might stop here. We lose four structures instead of the tens of structures that ignite here, and all the exposures that these structures then push further downstream.
Great. Yes, thank
I wanted to ask something similar. Codes basically can require greater distances and materials, but it's the existing buildings that basically kind of give me concern. And I was wondering if there's any data on what percentage of a community needs resilient buildings to have some sort of effect? So if it's just one or two houses that do this, it's not going to have much effect on the community level. If it's 25% or 50%, that, is there some data that shows how much protection could be had?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay, and something that is definitely in the works right now. The closest that the community's been able to get in approaching that has been through modeling. There's been a great publication by Michael Gollner, my old advisor, who's at Berkeley now, and they've released one of the most um, physics-based fire spread models that has the ability to take communities, change certain factors like, okay, this community has all resilient building materials or has incorporated zone zero, and make predictions on how they would do. I can't remember their threshold at the top off the top of my head, but um, based on our learnings and observations from these types of fires, my hypothesis would be that it would depend on the size of the community itself, the external exposures that they would experience, but we'd be aiming for, 70, 80%, definitely the vast majority of our community meeting those requirements.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Evan, you talked about obviously the risk of closer separation, and a question I asked Nate last week was, what is the role of external fire sprinklers in this? And water supply is an issue, and obviously the issues of new and existing homes and trying to get those on a larger scale. But is there a place for greater use of external fire sprinklers in these closer density neighborhoods?
So my opinion is that external fire sprinklers are not something that we need to or should be relying on in these communities. You could view them as kind of the icing on the cake in some instances if you're looking to add um, a layer of protection, but whether it's a water supply issue, a power issue, um, there's a lot of infrastructure challenges with, especially in high density communities with sprinklers. Also, a key component of these fires, as we discussed, is wind. Um, and sprinkler spray patterns have just been characterized for internal sprinklers.
Mhm.
And from testing that we've done at IBHS, I can tell you that predicting where water is actually going to land in a high wind scenario isn't possible at this point. So to say that you can rely on an exterior sprinkler system to provide water where you need it, um, I don't think is possible at this point. And that's what our research leads us to believe as well. So, it is not something I would say that can replace in any way, shape, or form passive solutions that include exterior building materials, fuel reduction,
Right.
and structure spacing. But if you have extra resources to put at this problem after you've already handled your passive,
That's good.
could be a place for it there.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to say that. I appreciate the way you approach that. So, everyone, we are at 1 o'clock. So, if anybody has a last question they wanted for Nate, or excuse me, for Evan, why don't you either turn on your camera or put it in the chat real quick. And I'll just remind you that next week's session is going to focus on smoke mitigation and indoor air quality and relatively new ASHRAE standards. So look forward to talking about that, and hopefully you'll join us. And also, this is the second year of the AI Oregon Resiliency Series, and we certainly would like to see a 2026 Resiliency Series. And I put my email in the chat if you are interested in joining Alan, Logan, Jay, and I in planning for next year. Please let me know, and we'll get you in the list of our activities. So with that, Evan, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see everybody next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.